The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Florence as Lorenzo walked through the marketplace, his mind heavy with the weight of recent failures. 3 months had passed since his business venture collapsed, taking with it not only his savings but his confidence in his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of commerce and politics. The whispers followed him wherever he went, former allies who now spoke of his naivety, competitors who openly mocked his downfall, and friends who had suddenly become scarce when his fortunes reversed. It was in this state of desperation that Lorenzo found himself standing before the modest dwelling of Maestro Giovanni, a scholar known throughout the city for his deep understanding of political philosophy and human nature. Giovanni had served as an advisor to several prominent families and was rumored to possess insights that could transform even the most broken of men into formidable forces of will and strategy. "You seek transformation," Giovanni observed as Lorenzo entered his study, lined with countless volumes and illuminated by flickering candlelight. "But transformation requires destruction, the deliberate dismantling of everything you believe yourself to be. Are you prepared for such a journey?" Lorenzo, desperate and having nothing left to lose, nodded. What followed would be a profound exploration of one of history's most controversial yet practical philosophies, a system of thought that promised not just survival in a hostile world, but mastery over it. Giovanni pulled down a worn copy of The Prince and several other manuscripts, his weathered fingers tracing the familiar passages. "Niccolo Machiavelli understood something that most men refuse to acknowledge," he began, settling into his chair. "The world is not governed by the moral principles we learn in childhood, but by the harsh realities of power, strategy, and the fundamental selfishness of human nature. Most men live their entire lives in denial of this truth, and consequently, they become victims of those who understand it." The first lesson came immediately. "Tell me about your failure," Giovanni commanded. And as Lorenzo recounted the tale of his collapsed business, the old scholar interrupted repeatedly, pointing out each instance of weakness, each moment of misplaced trust, each decision made from emotion rather than calculated self-interest. "You entered negotiations believing that goodwill would be reciprocated," Giovanni observed with clinical detachment. "You trusted partners based on their words rather than their incentives. You assumed that playing by rules of fairness would somehow protect you from those who recognized no such rules. In short, you conducted yourself as if you lived in the world as you wish it were, rather than the world as it actually is." Lorenzo felt each criticism like a physical blow. But Giovanni's analysis was undeniably accurate. His partner had indeed exploited his trust, taking advantage of Lorenzo's reluctance to secure legal protections that might have seemed adversarial. His investors had abandoned him the moment difficulties arose, despite their earlier promises of unwavering support. Even his employees had begun seeking new positions long before officially resigning, showing no loyalty to the man who had treated them with consistent kindness and fair compensation. "This is the first destruction that must occur," Giovanni explained. "You must destroy your romantic notions about human nature. Machiavelli wrote that a prince who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. This applies not only to rulers of states, but to every individual who wishes to achieve anything meaningful in life." Over the following days, Giovanni introduced Lorenzo to the core concepts that would reshape his understanding of existence. The first and most fundamental was the recognition that morality, as commonly understood, was a luxury that only the powerful could afford. And even then, only when it served their interests. "Consider the great leaders of history," Giovanni instructed, spreading out historical texts across his table. "Those we remember as successful were not necessarily the most virtuous, but rather those who understood when virtue served their purposes and when it did not. Caesar crossed the Rubicon in violation of Roman law, but history remembers him as great. Alexander conquered vast territories through methods that would be considered barbaric today, yet his empire shaped civilization. These men succeeded not because they were moral, but because they were effective." Lorenzo struggled with this concept initially, his upbringing having instilled in him the belief that good actions inevitably led to good outcomes. "But surely there must be some universal principles," he argued, "some foundation of ethics that transcends mere expedience." Giovanni's smile was patient but sad. "You speak of the world as it should be, not as it is. Tell me, what good did your principles do when your partner cheated you? What protection did your ethics provide when your investors abandoned you? Where was the universal justice when your kindness was repaid with betrayal?" Lorenzo had no answer that did not sound foolish even to himself. The second destruction was more painful, the elimination of the need for others' approval and validation. Lorenzo realized that much of his previous behavior had been driven by a desperate desire to be liked, respected, and thought well of by others. This had made him predictable, manipulable, and ultimately weak. A man who requires the approval of others has given them power over him, Giovanni explained. He becomes their prisoner, dancing to whatever tune they play, modifying his behavior to meet their expectations rather than pursuing his own interests. Machiavelli understood that it is better to be feared than loved, not because fear is inherently superior to love, but because fear is more reliable. Love is fickle, conditional, and subject to change based on circumstances beyond your control. Fear, properly applied, is consistent and dependable. This lesson manifested itself practically when Lorenzo encountered his former partner, Alessandro, at a social gathering. Previously, Lorenzo would have either avoided the confrontation entirely or attempted to engage in civil conversation, hoping to maintain some semblance of social harmony. Instead, armed with his new understanding, he approached Alessandro directly. "I want you to know that I understand exactly what you did," Lorenzo said calmly, his voice carrying a weight it had never possessed before. "I also want you to understand that I will never again make the mistake of trusting words without securing appropriate guarantees. Every future dealing I have with anyone will be structured on the assumption that they will act in their own self-interest, regardless of their promises." Alessandro, perhaps expecting the old Lorenzo who would have either raged emotionally or pleaded for fairness, was visibly unsettled by this cold pragmatism. For the first time in their relationship, Lorenzo held the psychological advantage, not because he had threatened Alessandro, but because he had demonstrated that he was no longer the naive, exploitable person he had once been. The third destruction was perhaps the most profound, the elimination of the weak self's attachment to comfortable illusions about how the world operates. Most people, Giovanni explained, live their lives according to what they hope is true, rather than what evidence suggests actually is true. They believe that hard work alone guarantees success, that honesty always pays off in the end, that justice naturally prevails over injustice. These beliefs, while comforting, leave them unprepared for the reality of competition with those who harbor no such illusions. "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must," Giovanni quoted from Thucydides. This has been true throughout history and remains true today. The question is not whether this is right or wrong. The question is whether you choose to be among the strong or among the weak. Lorenzo spent weeks studying historical examples of this principle in action. He examined how successful merchants manipulated markets, how politicians built and maintained power bases, how military leaders achieved victory through deception and strategic positioning, rather than simply through superior force or righteous causes. In each case, success came not from adherence to moral principles, but from clear-eyed assessment of reality followed by effective action based on that assessment. The transformation was not immediate, but it was thorough. Lorenzo began to see every interaction through the lens of power dynamics, incentive structures, and strategic positioning. When a neighbor asked to borrow money, Lorenzo no longer saw a request between friends, but rather a transaction that needed to be evaluated based on the likelihood of repayment and the potential consequences of refusal. When potential business partners approached him with new ventures, he no longer heard their enthusiastic promises, but instead analyzed their track records, their financial incentives, and their ability to honor commitments even when circumstances became difficult. This new perspective initially felt cold and isolating. The warm world of assumed goodwill and mutual trust had been replaced by a calculating environment where every smile might mask an agenda, and every friendship required continuous cost-benefit analysis. Lorenzo sometimes wondered if he had traded his humanity for effectiveness. Giovanni anticipated these doubts. "You mistake cynicism for wisdom," he corrected when Lorenzo expressed these concerns. A truly Machiavellian approach is not about becoming heartless. It is about becoming strategic. You can still choose to be generous, kind, and helpful to others. The difference is that now you make these choices from a position of strength and awareness rather than weakness and naivety. To illustrate this point, Giovanni introduced Lorenzo to the concept of strategic virtue. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the appearance of virtue versus the practice of virtue. A wise leader appears virtuous because virtue is generally admired and trusted by others. However, he must be prepared to act contrary to virtue when circumstances require it. and he must do so without the internal conflict that destroys lesser men. Lorenzo learned to distinguish between situations where virtue served his interests and situations where it did not. When dealing with reliable, trustworthy individuals, he could afford to be generous and open. When facing competitors or potential adversaries, he maintained polite facades while implementing careful protections against exploitation. Most importantly, he learned to make these distinctions consciously and strategically, rather than simply defaulting to one approach or the other. As Lorenzo's understanding deepened, he began to rebuild his life according to these new principles. His first major test came when he was offered a partnership in a new trading venture. The old Lorenzo would have focused primarily on the potential profits and the excitement of new opportunities. The transformed Lorenzo conducted extensive research into his potential partners, structured legal agreements that protected his interests even in worst-case scenarios, and maintained multiple backup plans should the venture fail to develop as promised. The difference in outcomes was remarkable. When the venture did indeed face unexpected challenges, Lorenzo found himself in a position of strength rather than vulnerability. His careful preparation allowed him to navigate difficulties that might have destroyed him under his previous approach. More importantly, his partners, who had initially viewed him as another mark to be exploited, began to treat him with genuine respect once they realized he could not be easily manipulated or deceived. This success led to others, and Lorenzo began to understand how the destruction of his weak self had paradoxically made him more capable of genuine achievement and contribution to others. By refusing to be a victim, he had become someone who could actually help others rather than simply being someone who needed help himself. The second phase of Lorenzo's transformation involved learning to navigate the complex world of alliances, rivalries, and shifting loyalties that characterizes all human organizations. Giovanni introduced him to Machiavelli's sophisticated understanding of how power actually flows through societies, organizations, and relationships. Power is not a fixed resource that some people have and others lack, Giovanni explained during one of their evening discussions. Power is a dynamic relationship that constantly shifts based on circumstances, perceptions, and strategic positioning. The man who understands this can accumulate power even from positions of apparent weakness. The man who fails to understand this can lose power even from positions of apparent strength. Lorenzo studied how Machiavelli had analyzed the rise and fall of various political figures throughout history. Each case demonstrated that sustainable power came not from brute force or inherited position, but from the ability to read situations accurately, build strategic relationships, and adapt tactics to changing circumstances while maintaining consistent strategic objectives. This understanding revolutionized Lorenzo's approach to business and personal relationships. Rather than viewing every interaction as either cooperation or competition, he learned to see the complex web of mutual dependencies, conflicting interests, and temporary alignments that actually characterizes most human dealings. A competitor in one area might be a valuable ally in another. An enemy today might become essential support tomorrow if circumstances changed. Lorenzo's former partner, Alessandro, provided an excellent case study. Rather than simply writing him off as an enemy to be avoided, Lorenzo began to consider how Alessandro's skills and connections might still be valuable, even though his trustworthiness had been compromised. This led to a carefully structured arrangement where Alessandro's expertise could be utilized while his opportunities for betrayal were minimized through appropriate safeguards and incentive alignments. The psychological transformation required for this approach was substantial. Lorenzo had to learn to separate his personal feelings about people from his strategic assessments of their utility and potential danger. He discovered that he could work effectively with people he disliked personally, while maintaining appropriate suspicion of people he found personally charming but strategically unreliable. Giovanni emphasized that this was not about becoming dishonest or manipulative in a petty sense, but rather about becoming realistic and strategic in a sophisticated sense. Machiavelli wrote that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. This is not an invitation to deception, but rather an observation about human nature. People will judge you based on surface appearances and immediate impressions rather than deeper realities. Understanding this allows you to communicate more effectively by managing those impressions consciously rather than accidentally. Lorenzo learned to present himself in ways that served his objectives while remaining fundamentally honest about his intentions and capabilities. When negotiating business deals, he projected confidence and competence while carefully avoiding overstatements that might later undermine his credibility. When building relationships, he demonstrated reliability and value while maintaining appropriate boundaries that prevented exploitation. This approach proved remarkably effective in rebuilding his professional reputation. People began to see Lorenzo as someone who could be counted upon to deliver on his commitments, who understood the realities of business without being naive about potential difficulties, and who could be trusted to pursue his own interests in ways that were compatible with rather than threatening to theirs. The most challenging aspect of this transformation was learning to manage his own emotions and psychological responses. The old Lorenzo had been driven by immediate emotional reactions. Anger at perceived injustices, hurt feelings when others disappointed him, excitement about possibilities that might prove illusory. These emotional responses had made him unpredictable and often led to decisions that served his momentary psychological needs rather than his long-term strategic interests. Giovanni introduced him to Machiavelli's concept of virtue, not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but rather the combination of skill, flexibility, and strength of will that allows a person to adapt effectively to changing circumstances while pursuing consistent objectives. This required developing what contemporary psychology might call emotional regulation, but which Machiavelli understood as the fundamental requirement for effective leadership of oneself and others. A prince who is controlled by his emotions is controlled by his circumstances, Giovanni explained. He becomes reactive rather than proactive, responding to events rather than shaping them. The development of virtue requires learning to use emotions as information, rather than allowing them to dictate behavior. Lorenzo practiced this discipline in increasingly challenging situations. When a client attempted to renegotiate an agreed-upon contract in ways that were clearly intended to exploit Lorenzo's previous reputation for accommodation, Lorenzo felt the familiar surge of anger and hurt pride. However, instead of responding emotionally, he analyzed the situation strategically. What were the client's real incentives? What leverage did each party actually possess? What outcome would best serve Lorenzo's long-term interests? The result was a calm, professional response that acknowledged the client's concerns while making clear that any modifications to the agreement would need to provide equivalent value to both parties. The client, perhaps expecting the old Lorenzo to either explode in anger or cave into pressure, was forced to engage in genuine negotiation rather than exploitation. The final agreement was actually more favorable to Lorenzo than the original contract, and the client's respect for Lorenzo increased substantially. These experiences taught Lorenzo that strength was not about being aggressive or dominating, but rather about being clear, consistent, and strategic in pursuing legitimate interests. People could disagree with his positions, but they could not manipulate him through emotional appeals or intimidation tactics. This predictability, paradoxically, made him more trustworthy as a business partner and more valuable as an ally. As Lorenzo's confidence grew, he began to understand one of Machiavelli's most profound insights: that personal transformation necessarily involves social transformation. The man who changes himself inevitably changes his relationships with others, not because he becomes dishonest or manipulative, but because he becomes more effective and therefore more valuable while simultaneously becoming more difficult to exploit. This created a positive feedback loop. As Lorenzo became more successful, he attracted higher quality opportunities and relationships. People who valued competence and reliability sought him out, while those who preferred to deal with marks and victims gravitated elsewhere. The transformation of his inner character had produced a transformation of his external circumstances. Giovanni observed this development with satisfaction. "You are beginning to understand that Machiavellian principles are not about becoming a villain," he noted. "They are about becoming effective in a world that contains both virtuous and villainous people. The man who can deal successfully with both types while maintaining his own integrity is the one who achieves lasting success." The third and final phase of Lorenzo's transformation involved integrating his new understanding into a coherent philosophy of life that could sustain him through future challenges and opportunities. This required moving beyond mere tactical applications of Machiavellian principles to develop a deeper understanding of how these insights related to fundamental questions of purpose, meaning, and human flourishing. Giovanni introduced Lorenzo to the concept of the virtuous cycle that occurs when strategic thinking serves not just individual success, but also broader social good. Machiavelli was not advocating selfishness for its own sake, he explained. He was advocating effectiveness as a precondition for the ability to serve higher purposes. The man who cannot protect himself and his interests is ultimately unable to protect anyone or anything else. This insight reframed Lorenzo's entire understanding of his transformation. Rather than having become cold and calculating at the expense of his humanity, he had developed the strength and competence necessary to act on his humanitarian instincts in an effective rather than merely symbolic way. To test this integration, Lorenzo chose to become involved in addressing a problem that had long concerned him: the exploitation of young craftsmen who lacked the knowledge and connections necessary to establish fair terms with established merchants. Previously, Lorenzo might have offered sympathy and small individual acts of charity. Now, he approached the problem strategically. He began by analyzing the power dynamics that allowed exploitation to occur. Young craftsmen typically lacked information about market conditions, legal protections, and negotiation strategies. They also lacked the financial resources to sustain themselves during disputes or to seek alternative arrangements when faced with unfavorable terms. Lorenzo developed a systematic approach to address these vulnerabilities. He created an informal network that provided market information and basic legal education to young craftsmen. He also established relationships with alternative merchants who were willing to offer fair terms in exchange for access to talented artisans who might otherwise be locked into exploitative arrangements. Most importantly, he structured these interventions in ways that served his own business interests as well as the interests of those he was helping. By gaining early access to promising craftsmen and by developing a reputation as someone who dealt fairly with artisans, Lorenzo created a competitive advantage that benefited his business while simultaneously addressing a social problem. This approach proved far more effective than his previous attempts at helping others had been. Rather than simply alleviating individual cases of suffering, he had created systematic changes that improved conditions for an entire category of workers. Moreover, these changes were sustainable because they served the interests of all parties involved, rather than requiring ongoing charity or goodwill. Giovanni recognized this as evidence that Lorenzo had successfully completed his transformation. You now understand that true strength serves not only the self but also the community. This is why Machiavelli's insights remain valuable centuries after his death. They describe not how to become a successful predator, but how to become an effective contributor to human civilization. Lorenzo reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The destruction of his weak self had indeed made him stronger, but it had also made him more capable of genuine service to others. By abandoning naive assumptions about how the world operated, he had gained the knowledge necessary to operate effectively within real-world constraints. By developing strategic thinking skills, he had become capable of creating lasting positive changes rather than merely expressing good intentions. The man who had entered Giovanni's study months earlier, devastated by failure and betrayal, bore little resemblance to the person who now commanded respect from competitors, loyalty from employees, and trust from partners. The transformation had been profound, but it had not involved becoming someone fundamentally different. Rather, it had involved becoming someone fundamentally more competent at being himself. This realization led to Lorenzo's final and most important insight about Machiavellian philosophy. It was not ultimately about power for its own sake, but about the development of capabilities that made positive contributions possible. The weak self that had been destroyed was not Lorenzo's capacity for goodness, but rather his capacity for effectiveness. The strong self that had been developed was not ruthless or amoral, but rather strategic and competent. Years later, when Lorenzo had established himself as one of Florence's most respected merchants and civic leaders, he would look back on his time with Giovanni as the period when he had learned the difference between wanting to do good and being able to do good. The destruction of his weak self had not made him invulnerable to external attacks. No one was truly invulnerable in a world of competing interests and changing circumstances. However, it had made him resilient, strategic, and effective in ways that served not only his own interests, but also the interests of those who depended on him. A lesson Machiavelli had taught, filtered through centuries of history and Giovanni's patient instruction, was ultimately about the development of practical wisdom. In a world where good intentions were common but good outcomes were rare, the man who combined moral purpose with strategic competence could achieve results that neither pure idealism nor pure pragmatism could accomplish alone. Lorenzo's story became an example that Giovanni would use with future students, illustrating how the principles outlined in The Prince could be applied not just to rulers of states but to anyone seeking to navigate the complexities of human society. The man who destroys his weak self, his illusions, his dependencies, his naive assumptions about human nature, gains the strength necessary not just to survive but to thrive and to contribute meaningfully to the flourishing of others. The transformation was complete, but it was also ongoing. Each new challenge provided opportunities to refine and deepen the understanding that had been gained through such difficult inner work. Lorenzo had learned that strength was not a destination but a way of traveling, not a permanent achievement but a continuously renewable resource that grew stronger through conscious cultivation and practical application. In the end, the greatest validation of his transformation was not his personal success, though that had been substantial, but rather the success of those who worked with him and depended upon his leadership. By making himself difficult to destroy, he had become someone others could depend upon in a world where dependability was rare and precious. By refusing to remain a victim of circumstances, he had gained the capacity to help others avoid similar victimization. The philosophy that had seemed so harsh and cynical when Giovanni first introduced it had revealed itself to be, when properly understood and applied, a pathway to genuine service and authentic strength. The man who could see the world clearly, think strategically, and act effectively was the man who could make a real difference in that world, not through noble gestures that accomplished little, but through competent actions that created lasting positive changes. This was Machiavelli's ultimate insight and Lorenzo's ultimate achievement. The recognition that in a complex world filled with competing interests and limited resources, moral purpose without strategic competence was simply another form of weakness, while strategic competence without moral purpose was ultimately self-defeating. The integration of both, the development of effective methods in service of worthy ends, represented the highest form of human development and the most reliable foundation for meaningful contribution to human flourishing. The weak self had been destroyed, but in its place had emerged something far more valuable, a strong self capable of acting effectively in the world as it actually exists while working toward the world as it ought to be. This was the transformation that made a man truly invulnerable, not to all external challenges, but to the internal weaknesses that had previously made him vulnerable to manipulation, exploitation, and defeat. Lorenzo's journey from naive idealist to strategic realist to integrated leader demonstrated that Machiavellian principles, properly understood, were not about abandoning morality, but about developing the competence necessary to make morality effective in a world that respected results more than intentions. The man who finished this transformation would indeed never be the same. He would be immeasurably stronger, wiser, and more capable of creating the kind of life and society that reflected his deepest values and highest aspirations.